Mix in the Dark.
Hey, what's up? It's my Yang from Mix in the Dark. It is back to school season. I get to go back to school this week, and I'm actually really nervous but excited this year because of my new role. I find that parents are also either really nervous or really excited, depending on whether or not they want a break from their kids, if you know what I mean. I have 2 school stories for you, though. They are pretty creepy stories. I wish I could verify where these schools are for my own personal knowledge, of course, but I have heard my own share of scary stories about my school, and I would say that they are in the same area of creepiness as these 2 stories. But I'm not gonna think about it too much because I still work there. Please don't ask me where I work. I will not tell you, and I'm also not gonna try to get in trouble for it. It's a if you know type of thing. Speaking of my school, I had training just the other week, and I met a coworker who asked me if I knew who Mix in the Dark was, since I worked in elementary, and she's been hearing rumors that Mix in the Dark works at her school in elementary. And it wasn't long until I just gave myself up because, my coworker friends around me were snickering and laughing and giggling, so I was just like, yeah, here I am. I heard that she has some nieces and nephews from Fresno, California that have been waiting for me to upload my videos, but I was lame. I didn't upload in time for their trip to Minnesota this summer. I'm so sorry. Here is a shout out for Juliana and Titan. This episode is for you. Your aunt knows who I am, so next time when you visit, I'd be happy to come by and say hello to you. Welcome back to school, and I hope you have an incredible year. Enjoy the stories. Story 1. I recently got a job as a night janitor at a high school. For privacy reasons, I will not share the location of this school. We end our shifts at 11 p.m., but I was informed that we would sometimes have to stay there until 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. at the latest. It depends on what needs to be done that night, and those extra hours would become overtime hours. I usually work with a partner. We try to work fast together to get out earlier, but it doesn't always go as planned. I've heard from other folks working the earlier shifts that the school is haunted, but half of the time they're just joking, so I never know to trust them or not. I was a skeptic at the time, so I didn't let that control my thoughts too much. Also, I needed the money, and they were paying me a pretty good wage, so I didn't let it crowd my mind. Anyway, it was my 3rd day of work. It was summertime, so the school was already quiet. Evening shifts were always extremely calm and quiet. That night, I happened to be working with an older guy named Phil. Besides all the other things we had to do, our big job that night was to clear the auditorium stage, repaint the wall behind it, and then reset it with podiums and whatnot so that it could be used for the school year. We didn't know if it would be a 2-day job or not, but I was informed that tonight would be one of those nights where we would probably have to go overtime. The shift started out fine. We did our normal routine. It was a fairly average-sized building, so it was easy to keep busy and keep moving. We usually cleared garbage for classrooms, vacuumed, disinfected tables, moved furniture that was requested to be moved, cleaned out the bathrooms, and occasionally performed minor repairs. Like I said, since it was summertime, many of the classrooms and bathrooms were not really in use yet, so we went through them fairly easy and fast. Phil and I left the auditorium to complete last. Phil has been working there a while and knows the ins and outs. Before going in, he hesitated and said that he always gets nervous in the auditorium, especially if it is later than his regular 11 p.m. time. He explained that he usually tries to complete the auditorium first and then go through the rest of the classroom so that he cleans it earlier than later into the night. But because we had to paint the back wall, it just made more sense to do that last. Again, I didn't think too much about it and just went in. At this time, it was only around 10 p.m. We decided that we would clear the stage area and see how long that took before deciding if we were going to start the paint job that night. Phil was betting on completing the moving of the furniture on stage before 11 p.m. so that we wouldn't have to start the paint job or do any overtime since it was a good stopping point. We started moving the general items toward the main center stage. The back of the auditorium stage had more bulky items like stage risers, large props, painted statues, etc. Surprisingly, we were actually able to finish moving the items to center stage by 11 p.m., our regular clock-out time. Phil turned to me and told me that we should go home and paint the next day. I looked at the wall. It seemed like it could be done under 3 hours, which was what we had for overtime anyway. I asked Phil if he was busy and if we could just do those extra 3 hours for overtime pay. He just said that he felt tired and wanted to go home. I told him my situation at home, that I was trying to make extra money to go toward my daughter's dance classes. My wife just got laid off and it was not good timing because I was still in transition to this new job, so for a few weeks, I had to find a way to save for the expenses that she used to cover. Phil was reluctant, but understood and agreed to do this favor for me just this one time. He told me to set up while he made rounds to make sure the building was cleared so that when we were done painting, we could just get out and go home. Phil left me to myself. Not gonna lie, the auditorium with its large space had this haunting echo as I moved things around alone. I decided to put on some music to help ease my nerves a bit. The janitors had this small radio that we placed on our cart, and we left it to share with each other. I turned it on to some random radio station that was already playing music. It wasn't even 2 minutes in when I suddenly felt like someone was behind me. I glanced over my shoulders to make sure there was no one. There wasn't, so I just continued my work. All of a sudden, I heard what sounded like footsteps running across the stage behind me. I turned the music down to listen a little harder. It was quiet, so I assumed that it was the echo of the music. I shook it off and decided to keep working. As I reached over to turn the radio volume back on, my walkie started buzzing. Phil and I carry walkies in case we ever separated and needed to communicate. At first, it was just low buzzing, and then it got louder, and it started to sound like a voice. I turned down the radio volume completely and listened closer to the walkie. All of a sudden, I heard it say, "Who are you?" I froze. This was not Phil's voice. It was the voice of a small child. Panicked, I radioed Phil to ask where he was. He did not answer. I tried one more time before I realized that the radio's batteries were completely depleted. That's so strange. I knew these walkies were old, but they were always fully charged at the beginning of the shift, and we don't ever even get to 3/4 through the batteries in one shift. I set the walkie down and walked over to where the paint cans were. All of a sudden, the whole auditorium's lights turned off. It was now pitch black. I couldn't even see the usually lit up exit signs by the door. Every single light in the room was turned off. The auditorium was eerily quiet. I felt around for the walkie again. I thought that maybe if I took the batteries out and then put it back in again, that it would work for just a second or two, enough to call Phil. That was when I heard a tiny giggle and running feet around me. I shouted, "Who's there?" There was no answer. I then said, "Phil, if you're messing with me because I'm a newbie, then that's not really funny." I heard a giggle behind my left ear. The creepy thing was that it was so close to me that I could feel the breath on my ear. I screamed and started to crawl and feel my way out of the auditorium. I did not even care what I hit. I tried to remember where I had placed things in case I ran into it. I didn't want it falling on top of me. I crawled with my hands out, feeling the ground and trying to get to the edge of the stage so that I could climb down and attempt to run out. I moved up maybe just 2 feet when my hand touched what felt like a pair of cold, wet feet. that was when I screamed my loudest and started cursing for whatever was there to get away from me. The light suddenly turned on and Phil came through the entrance door to the auditorium, wide-eyed and panicked. I looked up. It was just him and me in the room. He ran toward me from the room and asked if I was okay. At the same time, I stood up to rush toward him. I was so scared that I ended up slipping on the stage stairs on my way to him. I told him that the lights had turned off on me and I felt cold, wet feet on the ground next to me. Phil just looked at me and said that it was all going to be okay, but that we should go. I didn't even hesitate to agree. I took one look back at the stage area. The funny thing was that it had streaks of wet marks across the stage, like someone with wet feet was just walking on it. Seeing that sent chills up my back. Phil and I went to the break room to grab our things. We quickly locked up and darted out. As we were walking to the car, I asked him about the rumors of the school being haunted. He quietly said that he didn't want to scare me, but he's had his own share of run-ins with whatever was haunting the school. This is why he always tried to get out before midnight. He also told me that a long time ago, the auditorium used to be a pool for the school. After an elementary student drowned in the pool, they filled it and turned it into an auditorium. Eventually, it became a high school. I guess the rumors are true. After that day, I still kept my job because I needed the money, but like Phil, I refused any overtime and never stayed past the time that I was contracted to stay. I still occasionally feel a presence over my shoulders when I work. A few weeks later, my wife found a stable job and I looked elsewhere for work. Now I no longer work there. Story 2. My wife and I got married really young in Thailand. We were only about 15 years old at the time and had very little resources. We also had 2 kids together. Life was simple, but I felt I wanted something more. I wanted my kids to become something great and to not live the life that I lived. After talking to my wife, we made the decision to make a big move to America. We had a few relatives that were already settled in America, so we thought that maybe they could help us get there. We had to lie to the Thailand officials creating our papers about our age to appear older in order to get support and permission to come to America by ourselves and with our kids. We were recommended a lot of different places to live by our family members, but in the end, we chose to move to Wisconsin. When we arrived, we struggled to find jobs. Moving countries and having to learn the language was difficult for me. I felt the need to provide for my family, so I connected with other Hmong folks living around me to see if I could get a job. Luckily, I found this program through my uncle that was meant for immigrants like me. They would teach us English and help us get our licenses to drive. If all goes well, we would be offered different driving jobs, such as being a delivery man, driving trucks, or driving school buses. It was all free to us, so I really had nothing to lose. I knew I had to work hard so that I could get a job and would be able to provide for my family. Fast forward a few months ahead, everything went accordingly to plan, and I was offered to work as a school bus driver. Because I was better than most of my peers at English, they thought that I would fit the role of a bus driver. I would occasionally have to communicate with kids, school staff, and sometimes parents. That summer, I went through some safety training and communication tools for if I ever get stuck or get caught in accidents. I was also able to trial the route that I would take to gather and drop students. The pay was average for someone like me, but to be honest, I was excited to just finally be working and making some income for my family. I worked in the public school district for about a year. It was a pretty easy job. You were only busy in the early mornings and late afternoons. You had some free time in between, so I was still able to see my wife and kids. It wasn't a bad schedule at all. As I got better and understood my role more, the year after they decided to give me a route that was at the edge of town, basically the cutoff for this district. The houses were a little more spaced out. I guess it was a harder route because the houses weren't always visible at first. I was also a pretty safe driver, and this route would require someone who is careful with their surroundings. It's been a few days into school already. I went through the route and picked up kids like normal. It was a pretty scenic route to me too, so I didn't really mind this change. It also made work go by a lot faster. One day, I noticed that we had a new student at my first stop. This stop usually had a pair of twin siblings. I asked the new student what her name was, and she answered, Olivia. I made sure to announce what school we were driving to in case she was on the wrong bus, since I wasn't notified of any new students. She nodded her head, letting me know that it was the correct school. I told her to find a seat and that we would get there in about an hour or so. After dropping off the kids at school that day, I called the office to check to see if there was a new student that was supposed to be on my bus. The person at the office told me that the person in charge of bus routes wasn't in at the moment, but she knows a few students started and switched buses due to moving houses. I figured Olivia was one of those students, so I didn't really care to check up anymore. The school day ended, and so I dropped off the kids like normal, and Olivia got off the stop that I picked her up at. It's been a few days, and no one has mentioned anything to me, so I just kept at it with the bus routes. We are now in the rainy season. It wasn't until this one stormy night that things started getting strange for me. On this particular morning, I noticed the twins and Olivia were not at their bus stop. I waited around for about a minute, and then I left the stop. When it was time to drop off the kids, I noticed the twins on the bus, so I asked them where they were this morning. They explained that they were at the bus stop but kept hearing a little girl's voice screaming in the distance, so they got scared and left to go back home. Their mom ended up taking them to school that morning. It made me wonder if Olivia was okay since I hadn't seen her either, so I asked them about it. They told me that they didn't see a little girl that morning. The next morning, it was raining again. As I got to the bus stop, I noticed the twins weren't at the stop again, but Olivia was. I asked Olivia if she's seen the twins. I didn't want to leave if they were just running a little late. She didn't say anything and just walked over to her usual third-row seat and just sat down. I waited around for about a minute, and then I left. Once again, at the end of the school day, when kids entered the bus to be taken home, I saw the twins and I asked them why they weren't at the bus stop this morning. Again, they told me that they heard the same little girl's voice screaming, so they ran home. This was starting to sound really strange, but I really didn't want to butt into anyone's business or investigate because it was really none of my business. I just sent the kids home like normal. Strangely enough, even though Olivia got on the bus that morning, she wasn't on the bus to go home. I figured she probably got picked up from school. Everything kind of became normal again after the rain had stopped pouring in the mornings. All three kids were at the bus stop to be picked up and dropped off again. The week after, I remember that we had some harsh rain in the middle of drop-off. I ended up dropping the last 5 kids directly to their door since I knew the stops were a little further away from their houses. When I got to the twins and Olivia's stop, I dropped the twins off first, and then I realized that I did not have Olivia's house address on hand. She didn't even have a bus tag like all the other kids. I asked her to point me to her house. She pointed for me to drive down a little further. She then pointed for me to drive around the corner. We drove behind this large church-looking building. We then came upon a gravesite before she gestured for me to stop. She pointed to the gravesite and then began to stand up and slowly move toward the front. Confused, I scanned the surrounding area looking for anything that resembled a house. I asked if she was sure and asked for exactly where her house was. She did not respond. That was when I looked up at the rearview mirror and was shocked to find that I was alone. I stood up to walk the bus aisle, checking every seat on the bus, and couldn't find anyone. A little spooked, I rushed out of that area. When I got home that night from work, I told my wife about the weird incident. She had her suspicions that it must be a ghost. I had that thought buried in my mind, but I just did not want to admit it. The next day when I got to the stop, Olivia wasn't there. When the twins got on, I asked them if they've seen Olivia. To my surprise, they asked me who I was talking about. I told them that there had been a girl at their bus stop that gets on and off with them and that it's been a few weeks now. They just looked at me weird, but they were firm that they were the only ones at the stop. I dropped off the kids and went to the office. I had to know if Olivia was an official student or not. I found the manager and asked about Olivia and whether or not she was supposed to be on my bus route. He squinted at me and then he led me to his office area so that we could check the bus list to be sure. We found that there was no child by the name of Olivia meant to ride my bus. Actually, there was no Olivia in the system at all for kids riding the bus to that school. Not knowing what to do, I told him about picking and dropping off Olivia for weeks and also her requesting to be dropped off at the cemetery. My manager gave me a look, then let me know that a few years ago, a little girl named Olivia was on the bus route. She was involved in a car accident while walking to her bus stop in the morning. There was some rain that morning and the driver was not able to control his vehicle. It was only this year that her stop was added back onto the list of stops because the twins going to the school were new in town. Ever since I sent Olivia to the cemetery that one day, I haven't seen her again. Maybe she just wanted someone to acknowledge her. Once a year at the beginning of the school year, I leave flowers at her stop for her. I hope that she has found some peace.
Thank you for listening to Mix in the Dark. I am your host, Mai Ying. Mix in the Dark is available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast series. If you have a story that you would like to share, please send it to myxinthedark@gmail.com. If there's a story that you really enjoyed, feel free to hit up my tip jar on Venmo. Just search Mix in the Dark on the business tab.